The day I almost lost a century of family history was the day I found out I didn't end Oppos. T just live in the Shadow Creek Canyon. I effectively owned the ground beneath every single person who was trying to kick me out. It started at exactly 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, with the kind of aggressive, rhythmic pounding on my front door that you only hear from someone who thinks their HOA badge carries more weight than a badge from the U.S. Marshals. I opened the door, still holding a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee, to find Brenda Vance standing there, her hair sprayed into a rigid, blonde helmet that didn't end Oppos. T move even in the mountain breeze, and she was flanked by two confused-looking county deputies who looked like they'd much rather be at a diner eating pancakes than standing on my porch. Brenda didn't end Oppos. To even say hello, she just pointed a manicured finger at the rough-hewn cedar siding of my cabin and told the officers that I was a squatter, a public nuisance, and that my end, quote, illegal shack, end quote, was a code violation that was single-handedly dragging down the property values of her new luxury development just over the ridge. She had no idea that I wasn't into Oppos. T just some mountain hermit who'd lost his way, and she certainly didn't into Oppos. T know that I held the keys to her entire financial empire in a dusty filing cabinet inside that very cabin. You see, my great-grandfather bought nearly 3,000 acres in this part of Washington state back when the land was considered, in quote, worthless, in quote, by everyone except the elk and the timber wolves, and he was the kind of man who trusted the earth more than he trusted banks. He didn't in Oppos. T just by the surface, he bought the mineral rights, the water rights, and the timber rights, the, in quote, whole damn thing, in quote, as he used to say, and when my parents passed away in a freak plane accident when I was 24, I inherited it all. I was a high-level systems architect in Seattle at the time, burning out on 60-hour weeks and the soul-crushing gray of the city, so I walked away from it all to move back to the canyon. I spent 3 years restoring the original family cabin, putting in solar arrays, a high-tech composting system, and a gravity-fed well that produced water cleaner than anything you can buy in a bottle, and I was living the dream of total, quiet independence, until Brenda Vance and, in quote, Vance Legacy Properties, in quote, decided to pave over the ridge. Brenda was the kind of person who viewed nature as something that needed to be manicured, gated, and sold to the highest bidder, and she built 35, in quote, high alpine mansions, in quote, that looked like glass boxes on stilts, all managed by an HOA that she ran like a tiny, authoritarian dictatorship. For months, she'd been sending me these glossy, expensive-smelling letters demanding that I, end quote, bring my structure into compliance, end quote, with their aesthetic guidelines, which was hilarious considering my cabin had been there since the Great Depression and her development didn't in Oppos. T exist until 5 years ago. I ignored her, thinking she'd eventually realize I wasn't into Oppos. T part of her little club, but Brenda wasn't into Oppos. T the type to take a hint, and the morning the cops showed up was just the beginning of a 3-month war that would eventually leave her life in absolute ruins. End quote. Mr. Sterling, end quote. One of the deputies said, looking down a clipboard while Brenda tapped her foot like a woodpecker on a hollow log, end quote. Ms. Vance here has filed a formal complaint claiming the structure has no occupancy permit and that you're discharging raw sewage into the creek. End quote. I just leaned against the doorframe, took a slow sip of coffee, and smiled. Not a mean smile, but the kind of smile you give a kid who thinks they've caught you in a game when you're actually the one who made the rules. I invited the deputies in, ignoring Brenda's indignant huff when I told her she had to stay on the porch because she wasn't in Oppos. T invited, and I showed them the original permit from 1932, the upgrades from 1998, and the state-certified environmental reports I'd had done just a year prior. The deputies were actually impressed. One of them even asked who'd done the stonework on the fireplace because it was so well executed, and they walked back out and told Brenda there was nothing they could do. That should have been the end of it. But Brenda Vance had millions of dollars in construction loans riding on, end quote, phase 2, end quote, of her development, and my cabin was sitting right where she wanted to put a private clubhouse and a helipad. Over the next few weeks, the harassment turned into a full-blown siege. I'd wake up to find, end quote, notice of violation, end quote, stickers plastered on my truck, or I'd catch her private security drones hovering over my garden at dusk. She even went so far as to call the Department of Ecology, claiming I was poaching endangered trout, which brought out a state agent named Miller, who ended up spending 4 hours with me just talking about fly fishing because he realized within 5 minutes that the complaint was total garbage. But then, Brenda made her first real mistake. She tried to hit me where she thought I was weakest: my wallet. She hired a high-priced firm in Olympia to file an emergency injunction to have my access roadblocked, claiming it was private easement, that belonged to the HOA, and she slapped me with a lawsuit for, tortious interference, with her business, claiming my presence was scaring off potential buyers who didn't oppose to want to live near dilapidated homestead, It was at that point that I realized I couldn't oppose just be a hermit anymore. I had to go to the basement of the county courthouse and start digging through the archival records section, a place where the air smells like wet basement and history. I spent 4 days under humming fluorescent lights, scrolling through microfiche and yellowed vellum maps. And that's when I found the nuclear option. My great-grandfather wasn't oppose just a farmer. He was a brilliant, slightly paranoid businessman who had foreseen the day when developers would come for the canyon. When he sold off small parcels of the surrounding land in the 50s and 60s, he didn't oppose just sell them. He attached, restrictive covenants, that were so deeply buried in the chain of title that even a standard title search might miss them if you weren't oppose looking for the specific file numbers. I found out that the land Brenda's entire development sat on was actually subject to reversionary interest, In plain English, it meant that if the land was ever used in a way that, materially degraded the natural watershed of Shadow Creek, the ownership of the mineral rights and the primary water access would automatically revert to the holder of the master deed, which was me. But it got even better. I discovered that Brenda had taken out a $6 million construction loan using those very land titles as collateral, claiming she owned them free and clear, when in reality, she only owned the surface rights, and even those were conditional. I called up an old friend from my tech days, a guy named Elias who had traded in his coding skills for a law degree and specialized in predatory land use, and when I showed him what I'd found, he actually choked on his water. Jim, he said, staring at the maps, she didn't oppose. Just build on your doorstep. She built her entire house on a foundation of sand that you happen to own the rights to. If we trigger this, she doesn't oppose. Just lose the lawsuit. She loses the ability to even provide water to those mansions, We decided to play it cool for a few more weeks, letting Brenda dig her own grave deeper while we built a bulletproof case. And man, she did not disappoint. She started a smear campaign on the local Facebook groups, calling me a, dangerous squatter, and an, environmental hazard, and she even tried to bribe the local power company to cut my lines, claiming my, illegal hookup, was a fire risk. I documented every single thing, every drone flight, every fake complaint, every threatening letter, and I started talking to the neighbor she had bullied. I found out she'd overcharged a couple named the Hendersons by nearly $80,000 in infrastructure fees, that never actually went to the roads, and she'd threatened to sue an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable for having a bird feeder that, attracted unsightly wildlife, The climax of this whole mess happened at the Shadow Creek Community Center during the, annual development update, which Brenda had turned into a glorified sales pitch for Phase 2. There were about 50 wealthy homeowners there, all looking a bit nervous because the roads were already starting to crack and the, luxury, amenities Brenda had promised were nowhere to be found. Brenda was up on the stage in a silk suit, pointing a laser at a map of my property, which she had labeled as, future site of Shadow Creek Wellness Spa. End quote. We are currently in the final stages of removing the last remaining obstacle to our vision, she told the crowd, her voice dripping with that fake, corporate sincerity that makes your skin crawl, and we expect the derelict structure in the valley to be cleared by the end of the month, That was my cue. I walked down the center aisle, wearing my grease-stained work boots and a flannel shirt, followed by Elias, who was carrying a briefcase that probably weighed 30 pounds. Brenda's face went from smug to ghostly pale in about 3 seconds, and her lawyer, a guy in a suit that cost more than my truck, tried to block me, but I just handed him a stack of papers and kept walking right up to the stage. End quote. Actually, Brenda, end quote. I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. End quote. We should talk about that in Oppos, clearing and Oppos process, because according to the 1961 Master Deed of the Shadow Creek Basin, you violated the Watershed Protection Clause exactly 14 times in the last 6 months alone. End quote. I didn't end Oppos. Wait for her to respond. I hooked my laptop up to the projector they were using and showed the entire room the original maps. I showed them the end quote, reversionary clause end quote, that proved Brenda didn't end Oppos. Actually have the right to pump water from the creek for 35 houses, and I showed them the bank documents Elias had subpoenaed, which proved she'd committed, end quote, collateral fraud, end quote, by lying about the mineral rights on her loan application. The room went from silent to chaotic in an instant. Homeowners started shouting questions. Brenda's lawyer started whispering frantically into his phone, and Brenda just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The fallout was spectacular. Within 48 hours, the bank had frozen her accounts and issued a, end quote, notice of default, end quote, on her $6 million loan because her collateral had effectively evaporated. The State Real Estate Board opened an investigation into her, end quote, infrastructure fees, end quote, and 3 weeks later, she was served with a class action lawsuit from the very homeowners she'd been trying to impress. But the real kicker was the, end quote, road easement, end quote, since I owned the land the primary access road was built on, and Brenda had violated the terms of the original land use agreement, I had the legal right to gate the road. I didn't in Oppos, lock out the homeowners. I'm not a monster, but I did inform the HOA that from now on, end quote, Vance Legacy Properties, end quote, was no longer the management entity. I worked with the neighbors to form a real, legitimate community council, and we collectively voted Brenda out of her own development. The last time I saw Brenda Vance, she wasn't in Oppos, driving her white Range Rover. She was sitting in the back of a taxi, her designer luggage piled around her, looking out at the canyon she'd tried to conquer. She'd lost her company, her license, and most of her personal assets in the subsequent settlements. I'm still living in my cabin, and the, end quote, wellness spa, end quote, site is now a protected L corridor that will never see a square inch of asphalt as long as I'm alive. Looking back, I wonder if people like Brenda truly believe they can just erase history with enough money and a loud enough voice, or if they're just so disconnected from the land that they dawn into Oppos. Realized the earth has a much longer memory than any bank or HOA board. I saved my family's legacy, but in a way, the canyon saved itself. It just needed me to find the right paperwork to let it speak. So, I've got to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with someone who thought they could bulldoze your life just because they had a title on a piece of paper? Was there a time when you found out you had more power than the people trying to push you around? And did you take the high road, or did you let the system burn them down like I did? I see these stories all the time about HOAs gone rogue, but I want to know, is it ever really about the rules? Or is it just about people who are desperate for a tiny bit of control in a world they dawn into Oppos? Do you understand? Drop your stories in the comments, because I'm starting to think my great-grandfather was an Oppos. The only one who knew how to hide a trap in the fine print.